Latter-day Peace Studies is produced by peace-loving members of The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Any views expressed herein are not to be taken as official positions of the Church or its authorities.
Latter-day Peace Studies presents Come Follow Me. I'm Christopher Hurtado.
And I'm Ben Peterson.
Thank you for joining us as we discuss this week's reading of Come Follow Me as outlined by The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Our hope is that as we discuss the Scriptures, we will come to a more perfect understanding through experiencing the atonement of Jesus Christ and find greater peace in our lives.
Welcome back to Latter-day Peace Studies. I'm Ben Peterson.
And I'm Christopher Hurtado.
And today we'll be discussing 2 Corinthians chapters 8 through 13. Now, as it turns out, reading through these, it appears that this could be comprised of up to 3 different letters. So it appears that chapter 8 might be its own separate letter, chapter 9 might be its own separate letter, and then chapters 10 through 13 could either be part of one or both of those letters or their own letter by themselves. And, you know, it's interesting, as we were looking at 1 Corinthians, we were seeing this a little bit, and then last time we discussed this as well, that these letters that we thought were like intact letters, or at least I kind of conceptualized of them this way, and it's sort of the conventional attitude, that it turns out, well, these are maybe multiple pieces of letters put together. So we do have a lot more of the letters of Paul than maybe we realized. It's just that they have been condensed and edited into more succinct and labeled books. So
that's funny, Ben. You know how they really showed up as distinct for me. At least chapters 8 and 9 really felt like I was reading the same thing twice. And it looks like these could be letters on the same matter to different congregations.
Yeah, and that would make sense. Yeah, you're kind of writing out to different... I don't know why you wouldn't maybe like write the same letter, right? Twice.
Well, they're not exactly the same, right?
Yeah. There is some differences there. Yeah, and he's going to cater him to the particularities of those different communities and congregations.
But it's pretty much the same message.
Yeah. So chapters 8 and 9 are kind of called or labeled in my commentary, the collection, right? And I was looking at this and I was like, okay, in which Paul guilt trips and flatters the Corinthians into donating to help the church at Jerusalem.
Right.
And I got the sense as I was reading through, especially chapters 8 and 9, that Paul was kind of laying it on thick. And it could just be sort of the genre and the rhetoric, but it was uncomfortable to me the way that he was telling them, well, these other people are generous, and that means you need to be generous too. It just, culturally, I think it felt uncomfortable for me, but it could be, and you were kind of pointing this out, Christopher, that actually this might have been a very perfectly normal way for him to be eliciting, and asking for donations or funds for the people of Jerusalem. So.
Well, I don't feel uncomfortable saying that if you're a human being. I just have so much experience reading that I know from my experience that the more things change, the more they stay the same. Right? We're not that different from these people as humans, right? And so it's always uncomfortable to ask people for money, but
yeah.
You really took the words right out of my mouth, Ben. He's laying it on thick. And at the same time, yes, you're right. I think the standards that he's following are Greek rhetoric standards, right? And so the way that he's sort of flattering them and then, telling them that he expects them to be a certain way because he knows they're good people and this kind of thing, right? That's how it's done.
Yeah. And I get that. It also occurred to me that we're only seeing one side of the conversation here, right?
That's right.
And we don't know if there's some correspondence going on back and forth between Paul and these people. And again, we did discuss this a little bit in other podcasts, but we often will assume a lot about Paul's rhetoric that it might look different if we actually had, both sides of the conversation, so to speak. We're only hearing one side of the phone conversation, right? So if we saw like the response or the prompts that, elicited the letters that he sent, it might make it, feel a little differently to us.
Yeah, we're having to read into these letters sort of backwards the intent and the purpose. We don't actually know these things. We're just, we're just guessing, really. Right? And they're educated guesses. We know the context. And I don't mean you and me, Ben. I mean, we moderns, right, reading this ancient text.
Right.
We just don't have the context. We don't know exactly what was going on other than what we can see in the letter.
Yeah. So in chapters 8 and 9, another interesting thing to point out is that the word that we translate, or that is translated most often as grace, especially when we talked about this in Romans, charis, the Greek word charis, is used 10 different times in chapters 8 and 9, and it's translated as a different word almost every single time, at least all the times that I could count.
It looks like it is, the translators are using a different word every time, but I think that's true both in KJV and NRSV, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, and I didn't go through and double check if there was ever a reuse of the word throughout all of that, but in any case, there is very different ways of translating this throughout these chapters. And that seems to have to be the case for the translators in the context that it's being used, which I think just kind of speaks to the large lexical range and meaning of this word, right? And how grace can fit into all the aspects of this, for lack of a better term, Christian life that Paul is describing, right? From Romans to collecting funds for people in Jerusalem, right? It fits all of these situations that Paul is talking about. And so he uses this word to kind of tie this cohesive sense of meaning all together.
Yeah, it's interesting that from where we sit, we can't just translate all of them grace. Not one of them is translated grace even.
Yeah.
Right? I don't think one of them is. And so it's all charis, and we're getting all these different words for it to fit our context. And yet, the translator does the best they can. But there's a reason the Italians say traduttore traditore, right? The translator, they're pointing out, looks like a traitor, right? That there's a betrayal in some sense, at some level, right? There's going to be some betrayal of the original thought. It's inevitable because the original intent is just not there. Or maybe, so I work with an author where I can ask him questions about what he meant. And I still, even having that, I still sometimes can't do what he did in the original because it doesn't work idiomatically.
Yeah.
Even though I know what he intended.
Yeah. You got to do a footnote or something.
That's the best you can do. You remind me of Cicero, who uses words with, again, these wide lexical ranges, at least two different meanings, maybe more, right? And he's using these words very intentionally. He intends all of those meanings or multiple meanings, and that kind of ambiguity, and not just, I don't think ambiguity is the right way to put it. And I think this speaks to what you were saying about how charis works for Paul, right? It's not ambiguity, it's different senses, right? That there's so much that this concept means, right, for Christians. And so I think it's something for us to think about, to really ponder what that means. And it's interesting because in this context of giving, it's tempting again. We had this temptation before to think of charis as charity. Mm-hmm. I think if it's grace, actually, that does fit this context. It's just different from the charity that we see in 1 Corinthians chapter 13, which is actually translating agape, not charis.
Right.
Right. And that would be love. So this really is charity. That's what we're dealing with here, is charity for the Jerusalem church.
So then looking at chapters 10 through 13, as I mentioned, these are also widely considered by scholars as a separate letter. And one of the interesting things that came up about these chapters is that these could be the letter that Paul actually alludes to in chapter 2, verse 4, where he says something like, I wrote to you in great distress or in tears, right? And when you read that verse, you think, what do you mean? This must be alluding to some letter that we don't have that's lost, right? There's some other lost letter of Paul. Well, one of the very real possibilities here is that letter, at least part of that letter, is these chapters 10 through 13, because the tone and attitude of these chapters is very much in line with what he describes in chapter 2, verse 4.
Yeah, I can see that. So Ben, looking at chapters 8 and 9, you see in them, again, very similar content, right? So I'm just looking at 8. if you look at 8, you get a sense of some kind of communalism, right? Some kind of share what you have from your abundance, right? Whatever you have that you can spare, right?
Mm-hmm.
That you have above what you need with those who lack, right? Who are in need. That, and by the way, you may be in the same place someday, is said or implied at least.
Yeah.
I think he says so, right?
He does. Yeah. Verses 13 and 14. He kind of says explicitly that. Yeah.
Yeah. So it reminded me of early in the restored church history, right? That we have this idea of, what would you call it, Ben?
If I understand what you're referring to, it might be called the law of consecration, or it is sometimes termed the United Order, but it's not the right term historically now that we go back and actually look at what was happening. But that is commonly what it's referred to as, I think is what you're talking about.
Right. I think that's a perfect answer. The part that I said was tricky is the United Order part,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Yeah.
There's a misunderstanding around that. But we can say the law of consecration as it was lived and as it's understood by many Latter-day Saints to be the quote-unquote United Order, right?
Sure.
So without going too much into that, into the United Order, we do have this idea of consecration, and that the saints, we didn't really have tithing, right? We had bring everything to the bishop, and then the bishop will distribute it. And so this looks like that, right? I mean, it's anachronistic to say it that way, but they're very similar ideas.
Yeah, definitely similar ideas. This is what we see, or it seems more akin to what we see in the beginning of the book of Acts, where the very early, right, community in Jerusalem, right after the death, resurrection of Jesus, are living in a communal fashion close to the temple, right? And they're sort of anticipating the return of Jesus anytime.
Imminently, right?
Yeah, imminently. And which is, by the way, still the case with Paul, right? Here he's just still
That's right.
expecting this any day now, so to speak.
Right, until later, right?
Until
we
later.
read Romans already, but that's at the point of Romans, Paul's sort of changing his tune about certain things because he realizes he's getting old and he's going to die and Jesus hasn't come yet.
Yeah. Yeah, but, like you were saying, those verses 13 and 14, there is a sense here. I mean, it says fair balance between your present abundance and their need, so that their abundance may be for your need, in order that there may be a fair balance. Now, it's not 100% clear to me whether he's just talking about like material goods here, or whether he's also, getting more metaphorical in terms of like a spiritual sense, that if you provide for their material needs, then you will see that their spiritual abundance, right, you also benefit from that. I think that's possible, but I think that the people he's writing to, their primary understanding of this would have been, okay, Paul, so you're saying that we have a lot now and we give to them, and then, like you were saying, Christopher, in the future, if we end up being in need, that means they will be there for us. And I don't know if this is kind of like a karma thing, or more like again, the idea that there's this community and we watch out for each other, right? And we take care of those in need, and we don't expect that everybody will all be in need at once. We expect that some people will have plenty when others have a little, and it will all eventually balance out.
I like your other reading, though. It tastes good. I really like it. I can see how, giving materially can bless spiritually, right? That makes sense. And of course, to separate these two things out as if they were somehow separate, right? This is the mistakes. One of the mistakes that I categorize as part of the duality that's how I interpret the fall, right? The fall itself, the fall of Adam, the fall, not just Adam, right? But the fall.
Yeah. The broader concept of the fall, even within our own individual human experience. Yeah.
Right. Into this duality where we think that somehow spiritual and physical or material are separate, and that we're separate from each other and from God and metaphysically speaking, right? Not just epistemologically speaking. And that's why you and I, Ben, so often talk about the epistemological way of reading these things, right? That there doesn't have to be a metaphysical difference or a metaphysical separation, that may only be epistemological, by which I mean it's our experience, not reality qua reality, in and of itself.
And it is true that in some ways, our experience and perception can then contribute to the shaping of reality. You know, I've definitely seen that in my life. But if we're looking at some of the examples that seem to be provided by these writers, right? If we go back to the Gospels, we have this sort of difference in perspective, especially on like the Beatitudes between Matthew and Luke. So Matthew, when he's writing these Beatitudes, seems to be a little more focused on the spirituality of these. And Luke is a little more interested in like the material economics of them, right? Like, so Matthew says, blessed are the poor in spirit. And Luke's like, blessed are the poor, right? Like he's talking about material goods. And I thought that was interesting in light of the possibility that the author of Luke was at some point a traveling companion of Paul, right? And may have been more privy to his view of things. And so when we get here to this chapters 8 and 9, and Paul is talking about charis and saying that this isn't just the grace of God and your attitude toward him. This is also how generous you are to others with your material needs, right? This is where the rubber meets the road, right? You can profess all you want, but like, are you really acting out what you profess?
Yeah, I thought it might be good to mention too who the Macedonians are, because they might seem like, who are they? What have they got to do with this? We have all these letters. There are none to the Macedonians, but there are. So we're talking here about the Philippians and the Thessalonians.
Yeah. So some of the phrases here in chapter 8 and 9 has some of the similar stuff, like you were saying, Christopher, that really just were. I smiled a little bit at them, and they make me feel uncomfortable when I read them. You know, in verse 4, he talks about the Macedonians, that they were begging us earnestly for the privilege, right? For the privilege of donating. It's just kind of a strange way of putting it to me. And then here in verse 8, he says, I do not say this as a command, but I am testing the genuineness of your love against the earnestness of others. Right. And so there seemed to be some bit of like a competition going on here, right? Like, you know, who can demonstrate their love more by how much they're willing to give. And I guess that's the part that makes me feel a little uncomfortable.
No, I understand. And here's what I like about it, Ben. And just like in, you know, LDS church history, right? In the restored church, we had this same law of consecration in the beginning and then tithing. Paul is asking for voluntary donations. There's no, I don't see any tithing here. Mm-hmm. Right? Is there tithing?
Yeah, there doesn't seem to be any indication of that. I didn't see anything that would be like that in this.
So once we decide to, you know, I don't know if Joseph Smith quoted from these chapters when he introduced the law of consecration. I imagine he would have, you know, but I don't know. I do know that once we go to tithing, right? Once we go away from consecration to tithing, now we quote Malachi. Mm-hmm. So that becomes one more proof text, right? Oh, we want you to pay tithing. Well, then here's the proof text from the Old Testament, even though here in the New Testament we have this higher law. And again, Joseph Smith could have used these chapters to, whether he was inspired by them, whether he was giving a proof text, whether he was explaining these chapters, implementing them, whatever the case may be. But what is the case is that both in this context, in 2 Corinthians, and in the restored church context, there was a go at this. And then we end up, at least in the restored church, with tithing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I think we do end up with the way that donations end up with institutionalized Christian churches because of how they get tied into political institutions, right? It's not too long after this where something like that comes into play, at least within the Roman Christian tradition, right?
Are you referring to actual taxation from the church?
Yeah.
And that's something that for our modern context, right? The listener may not be aware of history and to know that there's not this separation of church and state, right? That the church was taxing the people, and that even all the way up until what? Not even up until the revolution here in America, right? In the United States of America.
Oh, yeah.
all the way through when, Ben?
Well, there wasn't a federal religion, right? But
Right.
there were still state religions, official state religions in the separate states. And that went up until almost 1830. That was a thing. And it's still a thing in some places in Europe, right? That the institution of churches is so much within the society that there is some funding that happens through tax funds in some cases.
So even though you have a very secular Europe, including Italy, at the same time, you do have a lot of devout Catholicism, right? And despite however many secular, even atheists there may be, secularists or atheists there may be, you have still taxation to support the Catholic Church.
Mm-hmm. So Paul does go to some lengths to try to specify, that he's asking for something voluntary. He says not as an extortion, right? But then he's also doing things like promising blessings.
Extorting.
Yeah. in almost, yeah, that's why I feel uncomfortable about this, right? Because he says some things that almost feel like what I would call spiritual coercion. And so verses 6 through 8, he says, the one who sows sparingly will also reap sparingly. And the one who sows bountifully will also reap bountifully. God is able to provide you with every blessing in abundance, so that by always having enough of everything, you may share abundantly in every good work. So on the face, when I read this, I think, okay, so Paul's saying, like, the more I give, then the more God will bless me. Isn't this, some facet of the prosperity gospel here in some ways, right?
Right. Yeah, I can see that too. And everything he's saying can be true on a spiritual level, right? And yet, again, it's always awkward and uncomfortable to ask people for money.
It is. You can kind of feel that awkwardness in Paul, I think.
Yeah.
Here. Yeah.
You really can. And even if everything he's saying is true spiritually, it still feels like, yeah, but you're saying that because you want me to give you money.
Yeah.
And remember, I say remember, if you don't know this, part of the context here is Paul has been accused of skimming, and that's why he goes into so much how he supports himself.
Yes. Yeah.
By working, right?
Yeah. So one of the things that I was realizing as reading this, I was thinking about sort of this question that we ask ourselves when we are giving, right? When we feel that we should give to someone or to an institution or whatever, that something needs our voluntary material support. Are we giving with the expectation that God will bless us with more than we give? Or are we giving with what we might call a faithful assurance that our needs will be met? In other words, okay, so I'm going to give $100 because I think, it's going to do good in this area. And I'm expecting in the next week or so, $100 is going to show up out of nowhere, or maybe $200 is going to show up out of nowhere. And that's going to, take care of all of that. Or am I just going to be sure that if I give this $100, I'm not going to lack anything that I truly need? And I think there's a difference there, like in attitude, right? Because one is expecting a particular return, and the other is just knowing that our generosity is just trying to emulate Jesus and not in any way trying to look for some sort of recompense, right?
Yeah, and I think, another way to look at it too, Ben, is if you feel to give, right, there's a part of you that, I don't know if it's because of something Paul said, you may be turned off by Paul and not want to give, but if you feel like giving, wherever that comes from, whether it comes from Paul's rhetoric, whether it comes from your conscience, whether it comes from whatever kind of inspiration, right, the Spirit moves you to do something, then the question is it any of your business at that point what happens to the money?
Mm-hmm.
Is it any of your business how much? So if you see someone who's in need, and if they ask you, not just see someone, if they ask you, I'm thinking of a friend of mine. A friend of mine had an experience where he felt moved to give. And then he felt taken advantage of, that the woman he was giving to was then asking for more and more and more. But man, you have no idea what she's going through. And you could feel like you're being conned. And that's not the same higher self that prompted you to give, right? Your ego now gets involved. And this man, he's a good friend of mine. He's such a great example. He goes in those moments when he feels that ego, he notices it and he examines himself in the moment. And he wants to respond from his higher self, right? the one that says, it's none of my business whether she's conning me, whether she deserves it, whether she needs it, what happens next. It's my business to give. And this is very much a Stoic way of thinking, right? For the Stoic, the only good is to do justice, right? And it's not, and that's what's up to you. The rest of it's not up to you.
Yeah, I definitely think that there's a sense in which if we do feel to give, like you said, then we need to trust and rely on the agency of that person that we are giving to, that they are then responsible for whatever material means we give. And it's once we give it, it's not ours anymore, right? It's theirs. We've given it, and it's their responsibility and agency to use it as they feel is needed, which is why, even when they've done studies on this, but why I feel that really one of the best ways to help somebody, even though it might be counterintuitive for some people, is simply to give them money, because it means that they can then meet whatever their own perceived needs are. Whereas if we put ourselves in the middle of that and we start saying, well, I'm going to decide what is best for you, rather than trusting you in the decision to make about what's best for yourself, right?
And I think we don't. This is an issue. We get hung up on that. We don't trust in their agency because look at them and look what they're doing, right? And that part of it, I think where that comes from, it's the same reason why we have so many rules in our religion, right? I don't mean to say that in a way, I'm not picking on our religion. This is a religious thing in general, right? Morality, following all these rules, the checklist gospel, it's just not going to get us close to God. Not just checking off the boxes, right? And so I think in some sense, and some of these rules come from the church, right? Whatever church, including our own church. And I think I get the impression that we don't trust each other. Right? We don't trust each other either. And we don't think God trusts us. And again, that's an epistemological thing. If we don't think, right? Thinking is epistemological. If we don't think God trusts us, that doesn't mean that's the reality. That doesn't mean that's who God is. That's who we are. And so that's reflected both in the way that we treat the one who is asking us, right? And well, whether that be the church or whether the church is asking us or whether someone else is asking us, and whether we're helping each other. And so I think the only answer that I can see that makes sense, Ben, is do what is right, let the consequence follow. I guess.
Yeah, I see how there can be a situation in which again, you have a responsibility of your own material means. And if you feel like you should give to another, then that's, like we were saying, that's where you give, and then you're done. You don't let your right hand know what your left hand's doing, is what Jesus says, right? But then there's also a sense in which you say, look, that's all I feel I should give, right? And there doesn't have to be a judgment in that, because you don't have to be judging the other person by saying that's all I can give right now, right? That's just a judgment of your own responsibility, your own material goods, your own material needs as well.
Right. Notice Paul is asking for donations out of excess, right? It's out of your abundance, right? It's not out of your lack, but out of your abundance that you're giving. And as we say in Spanish, I'm just translating the saying into English, everyone knows where their shoe pinches them, right? So I know how much I can give, right? And I know how to be honest with myself. The question is, am I being honest with myself, right?
Yeah, that's a really good question, right?
Always.
Situation.
Always, yes. Yeah. And I find it's very powerful because when we ask that question, who's doing the asking and who's doing the answering? I think you'll find if you ask that question, it's your higher self you're asking. And if you listen, your higher self will respond. And you can trust that answer.
So chapter 10.
Paul's attacking some opponents here, man. My understanding, Ben, these are the same people that we learned earlier were trying to take over his congregation, right? This is a congregation that he set up, this church, right? This gathering, ecclesia means gathering. So it's a congregation. And now these super apostles, he calls them.
Yeah.
I think sarcastically, I think that's much more obvious in the NRSV than in the King James Version, so that could be interpretive, but I think it fits the context, right? He's sarcastically calling them super apostles. The other interpretation would be they're the original apostles that Jesus called.
Yeah, and I think that could, you could interpret it that way, but I don't think it fits with the context. He does seem to be talking about, at a certain point, right? He says that these are pretend apostles, right? That these aren't real apostles. They're fake. And so I do think that word super apostle that the NRSV uses is probably better because it brings out the sarcasm. Whereas in KJV, it says like chief apostles or the chiefest apostles. And you may not get the sense from that Paul is being sarcastic. And I'm not 100% sure he is, but I think he is being sarcastic.
The other thing I see here, Ben, is that these super apostles, these opponents of Paul whom he's attacking, they look a lot like the sophists, and that makes Paul look a lot like Socrates. So the context is, and this is something I've always struggled with personally as a teacher. I've been a teacher for many, many years. I've taught many different things, as a matter of fact. I've been doing this since I dropped out of high school. And I've always felt like it's wrong to get paid to be a teacher. And I have to learn a living, right? So Socrates was saying those who teach wisdom, at least, right, they shouldn't get paid for it. So we can make a distinction. Maybe it's okay for me to go teach at the college and get paid. But if I were going to be, if my Sufi master makes me a Sufi master, am I now going to charge people? He doesn't charge me. Am I going to charge people to give them spiritual guidance? That doesn't feel right to me. And so that's the kind of situation we have here. And in Socrates' context, what you have are the sophists, who are these teachers. They're the first teachers that show up that are getting paid, and they're teaching rhetoric. And what they want to happen is that whoever they teach is going to be able to win the day in the assembly. Very similar context, right? Assembly is, again, a gathering, right? But this assembly, of course, is the city government. And I'm talking about a city-state, say Athens, for example. And so all of the male property owners are going to be a part of the government, and they're going to have to speak. And if they want their ideas to carry the day, they have to speak well. And so these sophists, they're teaching rhetoric. And they're teaching the people who pay them how to win arguments, right or wrong. That's at least Socrates' view of them, right? So he's saying they're getting paid to teach you to win an argument, right or wrong. Sort of, I guess we have lawyers today, right? That's what that made me think of. Right? Yeah, it's not supposed to be one of these bad lawyer jokes or even saying anything negative about lawyers, but there is at least this negative aspect. I think we can admit that there's a negative aspect of lawyers who are getting paid to win, right or wrong. Mm-hmm. Right? And so it looks something like that.
Yeah, the morality of the questions. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So it looks like Paul is dealing with something very similar here. These men are asking to be paid, and he's not. But that's the funny thing about it, right? Is he's actually asking for money, and he's actually been accused of skimming, of embezzling. And he's saying, no, this isn't for me. This is for Jerusalem. I'm working to support myself. And so that's what I see here, Ben. Something very similar to Socrates and the sophists.
Yeah, in chapter 10 especially, we can tell that Paul is in distress as he's writing here. He's really concerned that the people that he's taught the gospel to are now rejecting his teachings in favor of the teachings of what he calls some other gospel, right? A different view of Jesus and his teachings, and not just that, like a different view of how they relate to those, right? Like you were saying, whether they are preachers of the word and they should support themselves, or whether they should be paid for what they're doing. And he discusses this in 1 Corinthians as well.
There's something else that as an evidence of whoever they are, the super apostles being like the sophists, is that he actually portrays them as arguing, right? They're making arguments. And that shows up right here in verses 3-5, right? In addition to a lot of other language I want to talk about, Ben.
Yeah. So, verses 3-5, that's where I was coming to next. There's a word that's used in here that you and I, Christopher, had possibly the most heated argument we've ever had over something, over just this word. So we do not wage war, Paul says, according to human standards, for the weapons of our warfare are not merely human, but they have divine power to destroy strongholds. We destroy arguments and every proud obstacle raised up against the knowledge of God, and we take every thought captive to obey Christ. So as I was reading this, I also was looking at the King James, and the King James doesn't use the word merely. It just says that the weapons of our warfare are not human. And I took this statement, this not merely human, in the sense that they were human, but not only human, right? More importantly, they were divine, but they were also human, right? And Christopher, you were like, no, that's not at all what he's saying. That's not at all what it means. He's saying it's not human, and the word merely is a helper to that, to sort of stress that it's not. And that wasn't how I viewed the language at all. So we looked up, you pulled out your OED, right? And
the Oxford English Dictionary.
Yeah, and it turns out that
authority.
It can mean either one of those things.
Yeah, I think they're both valid readings, but I came to agree with you in that, in as much as there is an ambiguity introduced by adding merely that may not have been intended, likely wasn't intended. But of course, a better communication would be unambiguous, right?
Yeah, and I think the only thing that probably hung me up on this, otherwise I probably wouldn't even care about it, was that I think there's a possibility, however remote here, that this reading, because it's using warlike metaphors, that the reading, if it's read in the way that I was inferring, that people could use this to say, Paul is saying that it's okay to wage our warfare with human weapons, but more important, to have them be divine, weapons. They are human, but also divine, right? As in, it's okay if we take up our sword because God's going to bless it. What do they, bless the armies before they go out to war type of thing. That's the sense that I got from this. And when I looked it up, I thought that word doesn't fit. I don't think somebody would read this and then use it to justify, but I think that if you were making the case, oh no, Paul says here that the weapons we use aren't human weapons. They're just divine, right? We're just talking about arguing with our words and persuading people with the Spirit. And somebody comes back and says, oh no, Paul says physical weapons, human weapons are fine too, right?
Yeah, and I'd like to add to this because I think it isn't the word merely. It's not merely the word merely.
Yeah.
that causes this problem, right? It's use of this warlike language, of this militaristic language.
That's the more
and I have another
aspect,
good friend,
sure.
Scott Allen, who's been talking about this. He's a business writer, and he's been talking about this for years. He's been saying, why are we using all this militaristic warlike language in business? If you pick up, business books today. So even the book, The Art of War, this book on strategy by Sun Tzu, is used in business context. Now, of course, it's about strategy. And so it makes sense that you could use the ideas, but you don't have to use them by quoting Sun Tzu. You can acknowledge that the ideas come from Sun Tzu, but you don't have to use the warlike language, right?
Mm. But, maybe the idea of using those words comes from the fact that in business, there's more competition going on, maybe.
Right. But, do we have to destroy our competitors?
No. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. It's definitely a different level from warfare.
It is. So a lot of this language is used. So apparently this is not a new thing. I've never heard Scott Allen talk about Paul, and Paul's use of this language. I see it here and I think there it is, right? It starts all the way back with Paul. I didn't realize that we're talking about something to do with spiritual matters and using this warlike language. And I was reminded of some of our hymns, Ben. Some of our hymns are militaristic and warlike. And the church has been saying they're going to introduce a new hymnal, right? It's been how many years? It's been some years.
Several. I don't know, what sort of setbacks were introduced by COVID, right, for things like this, but
who knows? Yeah. I thought I heard, and maybe I was hoping.
Wishful thinking.
I heard. Right. So memory can play tricks on you like this. Did I hear, or was I just wishing and hoping myself that some of these hymns would go away? I know that as the church internationalizes, there's another reason for some of them to go away, because some of them are very American.
Very nationalistic in origin.
They're very nationalistic, yeah. And so, I was looking for those and the militaristic, both the nationalistic and the militaristic hymns to go away from the hymn book.
Yeah, and nationalistic is often tied with the militaristic, right? Because that's
right.
Part of the civil religion is the militaristic jargon.
I would challenge any listener who feels a little bit uncomfortable with this, first of all, sit with it, right? And then go read the War Prayer by Mark Twain. I won't say anything else. I'll just say, go read it. This is something you don't want to hear about it. You want to experience it. And it's an experience to read this War Prayer, the War Prayer by Mark Twain.
Yeah. And there's not a bad YouTube rendition of that as well, which uses some visuals that, might be a good thing to go to as well.
And, that reminds me, now that you bring in YouTube, when Shiloh Logan and Shiloh is the co-founder of Latter-day Peace Studies with Lindsay Olin. He and I studied as an undergraduate philosophy with Shiloh, and there's another man I studied terrorism studies with for my master's. And the three of us were making a documentary asking the question, is hyperactive nonviolence realistic today? And most people, when I say that, they say, what is that? What is hyperactive nonviolence? And I point out that we're not pacifists, right? Pacifists don't do anything. We're not sitting around doing nothing. And by the way, those people in the Book of Mormon who buried their weapons of war, who said they were not going to fight, they're not pacifists. They did not stay home. And if they had, by the way, they would have put their families at risk, because then the enemy would come all the way to their home. No, they went out to the field of battle. They did defend their families. They just didn't wage war.
Yeah.
They went out to the field of battle and they faced the enemy and died. And more people were converted on that day than died. And this was one of the lowest body counts in a book that's full of battles with high body counts, right?
Yeah.
And so to me, that's interesting. So we're making this documentary and we're asking this question. People ask, what does that mean? I said, well, for us, I don't know about you, but for us, it's making this documentary. And we're going around asking this question. And so the director of this film was Jared, not Shiloh, but Jared Hensley. And Jared wanted to communicate to me and to Shiloh his vision for how this film would make one feel. So it's not, this is the text, right? It's not, these are the images, although the images are part of it, right? That's the idea, is you're going to use images and text, and by text, I mean the interviews, right? To cause or to create or to foment, at least, right? Because you don't really have control over people, but you want to foment, you want to evoke some kind of feeling. And I guess, because this isn't a video podcast, I just want to share how he did that. And this is something that you can actually, I think you can do it to yourself. There's a little bit, since you know what's coming, it might not work in the same way as if somebody else did it to you, and you can certainly do it to other people. But he played a video from YouTube. It's easy to find, right? You have Ronald Reagan, and he's giving a speech, and you have the American flag waving. So just search YouTube for Ronald Reagan patriotic speech. It's a 3-minute, 32-second video, and it has Ronald Reagan speaking about our nationalistic values, right? Many values that we hold dear as Americans, right? And the flag is waving, and I think it shows, if I remember correctly, there are images of, maybe not of battles, but of statues, right? Of war heroes and whatnot. And so he played that video for me, and you feel sort of this pride swelling up because you're an American. This is if you're an American, right? And then immediately after that video, he plays a video from the church of Jesus giving the Sermon on the Mount. And it starts,
"Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven."
And so on and so forth, right? And of course, the music is different too. So it just shows you sort of how propaganda works either way, right? With either video, I have to admit, right? But you have this sort of swelling American pride and whatnot, and then all of a sudden it goes into this other, and it's contradictory, and you feel the cognitive dissonance. It's a powerful experience. That's the experience we wanted to create for people.
Yeah, I can kind of see that happening, right? Like where we're used to this certain type of patriotic feeling experience, and then we're sort of confronted with these more straightforward, simple words of Jesus, and being able to reconcile those two is not so easy.
And not just more simple and straightforward, but more pacific, right?
Yeah.
More peaceful. You know, it's easy to go for the war rhetoric when the flag is waving and the right music is playing and the right words are said. Again, this is rhetoric, right? This is maybe even sophism, right? The words that Reagan is using, and then Jesus. It's really, you have to experience it for yourself.
So why do you think that Paul or even we, and I say we in a general sense in our society, still persist with these war metaphors?
You know, my knee-jerk reaction is to respond with Satan, right? So because and nowadays it's, you know, it's the good guys and the bad guys, right? And it's okay, by the way, if we watch violence, because as long as it's the good guys against the bad guys, right? But they're bad guys. And this is, of course, how every act of violence begins. It begins by otherizing, right? Because the reality is we're talking about fellow human beings. And so the only way that we can really feel justified, right, in aggressing is if we somehow otherize them. We make them less than human. There's a dehumanization, not just otherizing, but dehumanizing. You'll see that in a lot of war propaganda. Right. Go look at your World War II propaganda posters on both sides.
They're animals, they're monsters. Yeah.
That's right. Yeah. So I think that's part of it. And so that goes back, I think even in Paul's time, you have the enemy, Satan, right? The enemy, which is now going to be something, you know, it's his own metaphysical reality, this person, right? This actual personified, not the Satan that we read about in the Hebrew Bible, right? The accuser, but a capital S being, right? Of Satan. Whereas, you know, I'm saying that accuser is often, I find in my life, Ben, that accuser is often myself.
Yeah.
You know, it might be others close to me, those who know all my foibles, right? But oftentimes, even when they get involved, even when those people are accusing me, I am the biggest accuser, right? The biggest accuser is inside of me.
Yeah.
And again, you can say that's an influence of an outer, you know, something exterior to yourself. I find that it's a part of myself, and that it's not something that I want to fight against, not something that I want to borrow from Elizabeth Gilbert. I heard her say once that she was talking about fear. You know, fear can come along on the road trip, but it doesn't get to choose the radio station. Right. So I think, you know, that's a part of me that I have to accept, but it doesn't get to choose the radio station. Right.
Yeah. Yeah. That's the thought that I was having in terms of, you know, it's not you per se, but it's a part of you. And the way that other people in acting as accusers have access to you in that fashion is through that part of you, right? And so there's a sense in which they wouldn't have that type of access to accuse you in a way that affects you, you know, without being able to do it through that avenue, right? It seems like maybe a very stoic type of a way of looking at it, right? I have control over how I perceive the world, and another person can't force me to change my perception of it. But through that part of me, maybe that's that accusatory part, right? That's how that comes about.
Yeah. I think that really helps bring out my point. I thank you for adding that. Part of what we see too, Ben, in this letter, going back, sort of panning out again and thinking about the rhetoric of it, right? We also see Paul belittling himself, right? And comparing, you know, those who, you've pointed this out already, Ben, those who do good, and surely you're as good as they are, right? And you're going to do good also, and I trust that, right? That kind of rhetoric. And then the other thing, I guess the last thing that I would say about this chapter is, and it's not just in this chapter, and I'm inviting the listener to look for this, right? Going all the way back again to 1 Corinthians chapter 8, verses 1 through 3, Paul talks about building up, right? He says knowledge puffs up, but love builds up. And here in chapter 8, he's speaking of authority being for building. And if you look carefully, you'll see that he talks about building up all over the place, right? Building up, or other forms of build up, or
edify,
whatever, edifying. Yeah. Depending on your translation, maybe, right. But in this case, in chapter 8, he tells us that authority is for building up. And so I think, we can mistake and misstep, right, in using our authority for anything other than building up, right? It's not supposed to puff up, right? That would be knowledge puffs up. Love builds up. Authority is for building up. I think we can, by the transitive property, we can say authority is for love.
Not for tearing
which
down.
Of course, right. Which of course, if we go to chapter 13 of 1 Corinthians, everything else, whatever it is, your authority, your knowledge, all of it passes away. All of it comes to its end. Even if that's a telos, then the telos is what? Love.
Yeah. Which is echoed in Doctrine and Covenants, section 121, where it talks about, even if we have so-called authority conferred upon us institutionally, it's of no power whatsoever unless it follows those principles that are even repeated by Paul here in his letters, right? Love, gentleness, meekness, forgiveness, persuasion, right?
Yeah. In chapter 11, Ben, I see in the first 9 verses again, I see Socrates versus the sophists. That same, I'm comparing Paul and his opponents to Socrates and his, right? And I see also one of the things that shows up right away. So right off the bat in verse 1, again, as I mentioned earlier, and this is already happening in the last chapter, Paul is calling himself foolish, right? This is part of his rhetoric. And I just wanted to point out that this foolishness, I think we've talked about sophrosune, haven't we? Sophrosune?
Doesn't sound familiar to me.
Sophrosune is the virtue of prudence, of practical wisdom, right? So of being able to discern the right thing to do. And so what we're dealing with here is aphrosune, which is means it's a negation, right? So aphrosune means the opposite of moderation or sober-mindedness. It means foolishness. Oftentimes in the scriptures we get the opposite of foolishness. We get different words for foolishness. First of all, there's moria and moros from the Greek, and of course wisdom would be like sophrosune, right? So sophrosune, again, I called it practical wisdom, this wisdom of knowing what to do. Another way of speaking of that is, wisdom, the word wisdom, right, in English, but that's Sophia in the Greek.
Here in chapter 11, as you were talking about as well, Christopher, you've mentioned this before, that there's already at the time of Paul, right, this sense, and we can see it in these letters, that there's various teachings about Jesus, various views about who he was and what he taught that are even, sometimes complementary and sometimes don't contradict. But in this case, where Paul is bringing this up, he's very much of the opinion that people are teaching things about Jesus that contradict his understanding, which he notes later, and especially in Galatians, comes directly from God, right? He's insisting on his authority to know the correct teachings about Jesus. And so I think it bears pointing out, sometimes I think we have this conceptualization that Christianity, so to speak, started off as this one unified movement, right? Which after a lot of time then split up into different things. But it seems, as we're looking through this, and even when we read right in the book of Acts, that at the very beginning, like very first, the apostles themselves already have different views about who Jesus was and what his teachings were, right? This is a very quick thing out of the gate. And so Paul is very much, again, in distress about the fact that people are going to his congregations that he has taught and contradicting him on what he has taught them about who Jesus is and what his teachings were.
So Ben, just backing up to verse 3 a minute, it's interesting because the NRSV reads, "But I'm afraid that as the serpent deceived Eve by its cunning, your thoughts will be led astray from a sincere and pure devotion of Christ." Now, this idea of the serpent deceiving Eve is pretty well known, right? This is commonplace. It's from Genesis. The serpent deceived Eve. Now, usually we say the serpent is Satan. I don't find that anywhere in the Bible. It does seem that Paul, by the time we get to the New Testament, Paul does use Satan and in it with a capital S, and he does seem like he's using the serpent and Satan interchangeably, but I'm not sure. I don't see it explicit
yeah,
right? It's
agreed.
Not that explicit. And so you and I both noticed commentary on this verse saying that that there's some connection between a tradition, this verse, and a tradition that says that Satan, even though the verse says the serpent, sexually seduced Eve, and a reference to something apocryphal. And it's interesting how it looks like it's from 2nd Enoch, but neither one of us could find it. So maybe we're reading the reference wrong. We'll have to look into that further.
Yeah, something to look into. Yeah,
get back to you. But point remains that we often use extra canonical texts to explicate our canonical texts. And Enoch is one of those books, or the books of Enoch, because there's not a book of Enoch. The books of Enoch are typically some of the books that are most used, right? And this is in Latter-day Saintism in particular, and Christianity in general. And then there's Dante and Milton, as I mentioned last time, and wherever they got their ideas that are sort of baked into their poems, which for Dante includes ideas from Islam, according to Miguel Asín Palacios, the great Dante scholar of Spain. So, yeah, I don't know what to do with that, Ben, but
my thought on what you were saying, Christopher, is when we go back to 1 Corinthians chapter 8, right? And it says, whoever says that they know something doesn't have enough knowledge. It's one of these examples, right? Where, we know that this is talking about this. And it's like, do we really? We sometimes make assumptions about the text that can't hold up, right?
Yeah, I see what you mean. Yeah. And so to give you another example, this one we can be a little more sure about, right? So we have Paul saying in verse 14 that Satan disguises himself as an angel of light. And I thought, okay, where does this come from?
Yeah.
And the answer is the Talmud.
Yeah.
But the Talmud isn't canon, right?
No, it's the rabbinical commentary, right?
Right. And so what do we do with that? Are we supposed to read that? I found myself in the position of Joseph Smith asking, should I translate the Apocrypha, right? And the answer is, well, there's some good stuff in there, and it can be, you don't need to translate it. It can be read by the Spirit. Well, apparently I need to do that with the Talmud too.
Yeah.
And so speaking of which, why not Dante and Milton? Why wouldn't they? If I'm looking at my ideas as a Christian about hell, a lot of them come from outside the canon, and they come from Dante.
Yeah.
And Dante's getting some of those ideas from Islam. And I'm not saying anything against Islam. I'm just saying, look how far afield these ideas come from. And of course, there can be some common sources, right? The question is, where did Islam get it, right? Mm-hmm. And then Milton, if I want to know about heaven, paradise, then I go to John Milton and his poem. And you think, well, but the Talmud and Dante and Milton aren't canon, and yet we use them to interpret canon. So the question is, do all these things you think you know, back to 8:1-3, 1 Corinthians 8:1-3, do you really know anything? And are you really going to fail to love, back to 1 Corinthians chapter 13, when knowledge is going to pass away, it's going to come to its end. And by the way, that end could be telos, right? It could be there's this purpose for it, and it has its time and its place and its purpose. And as the Quran says, God will inform you about the things you disagreed about. That's one of my favorite verses from the Quran. You think you've got this all figured out. You're disagreeing about things. God will set the record straight, between you. Don't worry about that.
Yeah. And why wouldn't the purpose of the knowledge be love, right? Ultimately.
That's right. I mean, that's how I read will pass away, right? Yeah. I never looked at the Greek. If it's about telos, that would be the best reading, right? It comes to an end, meaning a purpose, right? What's the purpose of all this? Love. And so without love, it's meaningless, right? That's what we're getting from 1 Corinthians 13. And so we think we know, but where did we get this from? Is it really in the text? No, it's not. It's from somewhere else. It's from Talmud, which we've never read. It's from Enoch, which we've never read. It's from Dante, which maybe you have read. I've read Dante. I've read Milton. I wouldn't wish that on anybody. But Dante, I would say you don't know what you're missing if you haven't read Dante. Yeah. Milton's worth the slog, though. There's a fun verse I wanted to point out, 11:23. This is just for fun, tongue in cheek. This is the verse in which Paul admits he sounds like a crazy person. Yeah. That's what I've been thinking, Ben.
Well, he started off the chapter with saying he was foolishness, right?
That's right.
Yeah,
that's right. Yeah.
Now, Paul gives this long list of his persecutions, so to speak, that he's undergone. And in one of them that he lists is that he has received multiple times 40 lashes minus one. And I just thought we'd point out the context to this. So in the Jewish Bible, in the Torah, it's mentioned that the maximum amount of punishment you could give a person is 40 lashes. And so you have this commentary, the rabbis come in and say, well, let's go with 39 because you could have miscounted at that point, and we would want to 100% make sure that you don't do 41, right? Because then that would be violating God's commandments. And so let's make sure we just only ever do a maximum of 39. And, when we were discussing this, Christopher, you said, well, what's the guarantee that they're counting the 39, right? And I was like, yeah, the only way to be sure that you don't give someone 40 lashes is to not give them any at all, right?
That's what I would do. Yeah, that you can be sure because you can miscount no matter how many you're counting, right?
Yeah.
1, 2, 3, 40.
Yeah.
Whatever.
Yeah.
So this reminds me too, and isn't that interesting? The rabbinical sort of, and when I say rabbinical, I don't mean just rabbis do this. I mean this rabbinical impulse, I'm going to call it, is a part of all of us, right? And the most famous example that I can think of, and when I say famous, I mean for me personally, I remember sitting in the temple once reading, I believe it was either in Moses or Genesis. It was the creation myth in one of those books. And I remember reading on 2 facing pages. So on the left-hand side of the page, and these are 2 consecutive chapters. I think it was 3 and 4. Maybe it was Moses 3 and 4. So you have God telling Adam and Eve not to eat the fruit, right? Don't eat the fruit. And then Satan shows up on the next page, or the serpent. See, I did it again, right? It's not Satan, it's the serpent, right? The serpent shows up and Eve says to the serpent, God told us not to come anywhere near that tree.
Not even to touch it.
I'm paraphrasing. Not even to touch it. That's it. Not even to touch it. And you think, wait a minute. I went back. I remember going back to the left-hand side of the page. God didn't say that. So either God told somebody that off stage, so to speak, right? It's not in the text. Or Eve is the first rabbi.
Yeah.
Right? She's
putting
making
the fence
commentary.
around the tree.
Yeah. And exactly the fence around the tree. Yeah. And we do that, right? We want to create these fences around things and make these commandments into these fences that are supposed to keep us from giving 40 lashes, right? By giving only 39 lashes.
Yeah.
So I thought that was worth bringing that in.
Yeah.
And by the way, I think too, we all have the rabbinical impulse, I've said, but I also thought, I don't know if this is archetypally feminine or if it's just my wife, but I thought, I can see my wife doing that, right? You know what? Don't even go anywhere near it. Let's just avoid, we're not even going to go anywhere near the tree. And I was also remembered of a talk in a priesthood session years ago. I think I was with Shiloh at this priesthood session, but I remember this talk that said it was about the Devil's Throat, which is a waterfall in Brazil. And people it's one of those like in the, let me guess, we're about to go over the waterfall, sharp rocks at the bottom, right? Like in,
Emperor's
what's
New
that
Groove.
movie? The Emperor's New Groove. People like to row their boat out to that rock that's there right before the waterfall so they can stand on it and look into the Devil's Throat, as it were. And the general authority, the LDS general authority who was giving this talk said, don't even go anywhere near the Devil's Throat, right? It's that same idea. So first we put the fence, then we push the fence farther and farther out.
Yeah.
And we do this because, why do we do this, Ben? I mean, we just want to be careful, of course. We want to keep the rules. But I think something tells me, my mystical impulse, right, tells me, because it's not about morality. Getting close to God is not about morality. I mean, I think morality is important, right? It's part of it, but it's not enough, right? It's necessary, but it's not sufficient, to put it in philosophical terms. And so I think we have to get behind what the rule is. It's why the rule, right? To understand and what is the rule pointing to, and go into that. So it's once again, just like looking at the finger instead of where it's pointing.
I think another way that it can happen, and this may not always be the case, but another way it can happen where the fence gets put around is that someone in authority right, gets authority, or so they assume, says Doctrine and Covenants 121, they exercise unrighteous dominion. What does that mean? Well, they are claiming the authority to then start defining the border of this thing, right? So now all of a sudden, it's not a personal, internal moral question that each individual has to judge for themselves. Now they become the judge of the moral question. Right.
And now we're back to what you were saying earlier about when we give money, right?
Yeah.
It's about agency in both cases. So there goes your agency.
Yeah.
So this litany of things, including the 40 lashes that Paul gives us in verses 24 through 33, seem to say something like, hey, any of those super apostles do any of this? Huh?
Yeah.
Look at me. I'm the one who's doing all this suffering for you. They're just showing up and, they're asking for money and flattering you, and they're sophists, because they're arguing, right? He says we destroy their argument, so they must be arguing. That's what he seems to be doing here. There's a style to it, though, Ben, that you noted in your studies. Did you want to go into that?
Yeah, a little bit. And I'm not sure that I have a full grasp on what's going on here, but I remember N.T. Wright in his biography on Paul talking about how Paul is sort of contrasting or juxtaposing his experience against that of what might be the typical curriculum vitae or, resume of a soldier in a militaristic context, where the soldier is going to list, all his military prowess, all his victories, and all the, the people he's killed, or the, when he got on top of the wall first, and all these sorts of things, or the spoils he has won, the slaves he has taken, things like that. And they're going to list this as their credentials, so to speak, as a soldier. And Paul comes in here, and his credentials are the inverse of that, right? They're all of the persecutions he's undergone, and all of the lashings he's taken, right? And all the punishments in the prison that he's gone in. And these are sort of the anti-credentials, so to speak. But for Paul, because he is a servant of Christ, right, and has come out of the world, so to speak, and is really, it's a different thing going on here than the human way of doing things, he says, right? The divine way of doing things. Paul is presenting this as evidence, right, that he is more qualified. These are his Christian, again, for lack of a better term, credentials, right?
Yeah, isn't that interesting? We get this sense of, once again, of the morality that is communicated by Paul as being related to Jesus, right? Because you have the Roman project of peace through victory, and you win by killing, right? Mm-hmm. And then you have the Jesus project, which is peace through justice, the Pax Christi as opposed to the Pax Romana. And you have that it's through justice, and you win by dying. Yeah. And so it's this, weakness is what makes you strong. You win by dying, not by killing. So we're back to a Paul that looks less militaristic than those verses we were talking about earlier, right? This is nice, yeah. Where he's saying, look, I've done all this suffering. That shows the manner of man that I am in a Christian context, right?
Yeah, and when we get also in Galatians, and there's hints of this in Romans as well, Paul talking about Jesus in the context of these sufferings, and then ultimately his death, right, is that these are the proofs of their faithfulness, right? That they're willing to stay committed to God and be faithful to God, even through all these persecutions and even until death, right? And so there's things in these letters of Paul that get translated as, faith in Christ. But when we look at the Greek, it actually might be better to translate it as the faith of Christ, or the faithfulness of Jesus, right? In other words, we're looking to his faithfulness, how he lived his life despite the persecutions, despite the crucifixion unto death, right? That he stayed faithful through all of that unto death. And that's the model for us. No matter what persecutions and difficulties we go to, we stay faithful.
Yeah. Ben, wrapping up chapter 11, I see the verse you mentioned where Paul actually calls those super apostles false apostles.
Yeah.
Which makes it clear that when even the King James translates, chief apostles, you can still read that sarcastically. It's just that's not our language, right? That's not our everyday language. King James, Elizabethan English, right?
Yeah. So I think the super
Even though
works.
we've grown up with it.
Yeah.
Yeah, Super Apostles works really well. I like it. So then we get into 2 Corinthians 12, and in verse 2, we have a vision that Paul mentions. He knows someone who's caught up in the third heaven. And you think, okay, there it is, right? There are 3 heavens. Now, we talked about this back in 1 Corinthians 15, 40 through 41, the 3 degrees of glory, or is it 7, or is it a dichotomy that ultimately it looks like Paul is presenting a dichotomy, right? So it's got nothing to do with however many heavens there are, but anciently there were 7 heavens. And so once again, we don't have to read this verse as whoever this is was caught up into the highest heaven. That's not what it says. It says the third heaven. Could be out of 3, and then it would be the highest. Could be out of 7, and then it wouldn't. And it has a name, and it's paradise. That shows up in another verse. But again, if you're equating paradise with the Latter-day Saint concept of the celestial kingdom, I don't think you can justify that, right? You can't say, oh, paradise equals the celestial kingdom.
Yeah, I don't know that it maps the way that, as neatly, right, as we would like it to here. And
that's right.
You're to your point, Christopher. Yeah, this is third, right? And this could be third of 7 or third of 3. And because even at this time before this time, there is rabbinical commentary, Jewish ideas of there being 7 heavens or a progression of heaven that has 7 different levels, so to speak. And other ideas about this, by rabbis as well, saying it's 3, right? So there's actually 2 different ideas on this. One is 3 and one is 7. And Paul could be talking about either one. And maybe he's being intentionally ambiguous on it, right? Because he may be like, I don't want to get into this. Let's just say the third, right? So that either person can think they're right about it. I don't know.
But I just realized there's one more of these references to the Talmud in the last chapter, right? We moved on from chapter 11, but I want to go back a minute because in verse 14, we have that Satan disguises himself. Once again, where does that come from? And the answer is, it's depicted in a Talmudic source, right, that Satan disguises himself as a woman. And he does this so that he can entangle in sin even great rabbis, like rabbis Meir and Akiva. And these are rabbis who had said that people can easily subdue their evil inclination. And Satan says, oh yeah? I'm going to disguise myself as a woman and seduce them and make hypocrites of them. So again, where does that come from? It comes from the Talmud.
Yeah.
And here it is. And of course, that's known to Paul. And that's not I don't have a problem with that, right? That's not my point. My point is, it's in our canon, and it has nothing to do with our canon, other than, it's in our canon, right? But it comes from the Talmud, and that's not part of our canon.
Right.
Maybe something worth reading.
Right.
I've got a lot to read, Ben. Can you see why I'm reading a book every day? I feel like I'm trying to catch up.
So going back to 12, picking back up on this discussion about this third heaven that Paul says he knows a person, but right, it's obvious that it's him, right? He's just being rhetorically humble, right? It turns out here, he says in verse 4 that he heard things that are not to be told, that no mortal is permitted to repeat. He calls them unutterable utterances. Right, this is sort of paradoxical way of putting it. And, this goes back to a theme that we've discussed a lot of times. And, the question always comes up, okay, is it that they are formally proscribed, like he's not supposed to say it, like he technically could, but he's not supposed to do it? Or is it that these are of such a nature that you simply can't describe them in words? And it seems here pretty clear that Paul is talking about that second sense, right? In which these are experiences that you can't express in words. They don't fit in that way. You just have to experience them to understand, or to even begin to understand what it is.
Yeah, it could be either. It could be both. These are the mysteries of God. Mystery, again, from mystis, right, where we get the word mystic. This is that which cannot be said. And there are, again, 2 reasons, as you pointed out, Ben, why it cannot be said. If you join a mystery cult, which would be a lot like us going to the temple, right? Mm-hmm. You're initiated. That's what we call the endowment. You're initiated and you're given this knowledge that you're not supposed to share outside of that circle, right?
Mm-hmm.
Where you gain that knowledge. It's the same in our temple. And so that's one sense. You're not supposed to tell anybody, right? The other sense is you just can't. And I think you're right. I mean, here he's saying they're unutterable utterances. And this is the paradox of language, right? That it says both too little and too much at the same time, and that our experience of God cannot fit in language. And so if you search through reason, through language, all you can find is there's no God. If you experience God, on the other hand, then you know there is God, you see?
You know, and I look at those, the formal, right, prohibitions, so to speak, against talking about certain things as symbolic ways of pointing us to this truth that what we're looking for are experiences that we can't express in words, right? And so again, we are told, hey, there are things you're going to experience here that you shouldn't, quote unquote, share with other people. And again, the symbolism of that is there are experiences that you're looking for in life, and even maybe here in this setting, that you won't be able to express to other people. And when you have that experience, then you know, oh, that's what I was looking for, right? That's the thing. That's the thing. Not this symbolic thing that I'm not supposed to share. That's just symbolic of the fact that there's this other thing I'm supposed to be seeking and experiencing that I truly can't share because I can't express it.
I love that reading, Ben. That tastes so good. You know, it really is. You're saying that the one just reduces to the other, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. I get that. And I think that's a good way to actively listen and participate in those experiences, right? To have that in mind rather than, oh, I'm not supposed to tell anybody.
Yeah, because that's not the thing, right? That's just the finger.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. Now that you pointed out, Ben, I think I'm pretty confident in saying this. There are far fewer things that you're not supposed to discuss about the temple experience outside of the temple than are commonly made out to be, right? They are the signs and tokens. That's it. Everything else is actually found in the scriptures, right?
Yeah.
Although, and I don't think this means that this is an exception. They are found in the scriptures, although there are some variations, right? Think about it. Earlier we were saying, where does it say the serpent is Satan? Well, the answer is perhaps in the temple text.
Yeah, there you go.
Right?
Yeah.
Perhaps in the temple text. And by the way, perhaps in the Islamic tradition, there might be something. I know there's something, for example, that is taught in our temple that is not found in our canon, that is found in the Quran. In the second chapter. I don't mind telling people it's in the second chapter. I try to get people to read the Quran by pointing this out.
However you can get it.
I don't mind telling you it's in the second chapter because that just happens to be the longest chapter in the Quran. So if you read that, you're a fair way into the book and you may as well finish. But yeah, there really is something that's taught in the temple that's not found anywhere in the standard works and is found in the Quran. And I just find that really interesting.
Cool.
And so what if the experience that you're having, it's not the words, it's not the stories, the myths that are told, those are found in the scriptures, but it's whatever's in between the line. I'm reminded of something I heard Dan McClellan talking about in one of his recent videos, right? That the word of God is this living thing. It's not a text. It's not the temple text. It's something that prophets experience. And if you're receiving prophecy, right? Or if you're receiving revelation and you're going to prophesy, as Paul would have you, although we went through his definition, it's a little bit different, right? Then that's the word of God, not the text, but something in between the lines, something that you experience through the text that is not the text itself.
Yeah. Yeah. Actually, there's very good indications of that. I think I get from Nephi in the Book of Mormon, where he goes on and on and on and talks or discusses about this. And in a certain chapter, he says, I'm trying to get this point across, but I'm realizing that I can't, that you are going to have to go and have your own experience and understand what this is. And, you were talking, Christopher, about, there's very few things that we really are told not to talk about, right? But then we put a fence around that, right? Like we were just talking about.
That's
right?
a
We
good
say,
point, Ben.
well, but we want to be careful not to talk about those. So to be careful not to talk about those, we don't want to talk about any of it, right?
Right.
Well, I get that. I understand, again, where that feeling, that understanding comes from. But
That rabbinical impulse.
yeah, that rabbinical impulse. But what that ends up doing is creating this aura of secrecy and taboo that ends up disturbing, I think, people that haven't had the experience, or maybe have, but because of that sort of idea that they already had in their head about how it was going to be, right? It's already changed the experience for them such that they can't experience the intent, I think. And so we're doing a disservice, I think, to the intended purpose of that ritual if we treat it in a way that is fencing around it too much.
Yeah, and once again, to go the other direction from fencing, we get at this insight by thinking about what lies behind the rule instead of focusing on the rule, looking where it's pointing.
Yeah. There's a verse here, verse 7 of chapter 12, Christopher, where Paul mentions that he has a thorn in the flesh. And there's lots of speculation about what this is. Paul doesn't say what it is, right? It seems to be some sort of physical malady or daily difficulty that he experiences. But I've just heard all kinds of different speculation on what this thing is. But again, the commentary is just like, we don't know.
Ben, of course there's lots of speculation.
Right. 'Cause
Paul doesn't tell us what it is.
Yeah.
So now we have to guess, right? We don't know why Paul is talking about baptism for the dead in our last episode, right? But we do know whatever it is, it's not what the Mormons think because they're stupid, right? Isn't that what you found in Googling that question?
Yeah, that's generally what I found.
Now, I just wanted to point out, oftentimes what we see in this Christian morality of being weak makes you strong. It's something that shows up again in 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verse 10. And this is what Nietzsche called slave morality. Nietzsche's famous for saying God is dead. And I think people get the wrong idea about what Nietzsche was saying. God is dead, woohoo. That's not what he was saying.
He's not celebrating it. Yeah.
No, he was saying God is dead. Now what the heck do we do?
Yeah.
Right. So we've decided to set God aside. Well, what about our morality? Right. What do we do now? It's more like God is dead. Oh, shoot.
Yeah.
What do we do about this? By the way, I know Nietzsche is dead.
Yeah.
Nietzsche says God is dead. God says Nietzsche is dead. But again, I think we have to understand where he's coming from. And by the way, here we are, Ben, introducing maybe even being pioneers in introducing historical critical scholarship to mainstream Latter-day Saint audience, right? To a mainstream Latter-day Saint audience. And that was something started by Nietzsche. And it's something that you really can't get around anymore. And that's why we're here talking about it, right? Because it's just, you can't not anymore. That's where we are because of the availability of this information in today's information age, right?
Yeah.
And
to take the scriptures seriously, you have to deal with it. Yeah.
That's right. And I love that you said to take the scriptures seriously. I remember one of the first, it was on the Maxwell Institute that I heard Pete Enns. He was being interviewed on his book, The Sin of Certainty, Why God Wants Our Trust More Than Our Correct Belief. See, we're back to this pistis, this faith as a trust. I don't know that God's really worried about us having the correct belief. I mean, I think, he wants to lead us to correct belief, but to be in a relationship with him, all we have to do is trust. And so if we go all the way back to the Hebrew Bible, all the way back to the Old Testament, and what you and I have been doing, Ben, on this podcast, we see through the ancient Hebrew eyes a violent God that we don't recognize when we look at Jesus, the cruciform, right? Jesus, right? That cruciform hermeneutic where we say, I'm going to measure everything that is said about God by the incarnation of God in the flesh, in the person of Jesus, right? In that sense that we talk about him. And so you have these ancient Hebrews who think that God is violent, and we've talked about God saying, okay, I'm not your warrior God, but I'm glad you want to have a relationship with me. He's asking for trust. He's asking for a relationship, and he can be patient enough while we discover, right? While we uncover, while we remove the veils, or he removes the veils. We can't do it ourselves, right? But we have to be ready, and we have to prepare ourselves to be ready so that we can know God face to face, not through a glass darkly, as Paul puts it, as we do now, but then face to face. One of the distinctions Paul makes between himself as a true apostle and these super apostles he's called false apostles is that one gives and the other takes. Now, again, it's interesting. It's tricky for Paul because he's asking for money, but it's not for himself he's asking. He tells us he's supporting himself. He's asking for the people of Jerusalem, the church in Jerusalem, where people are in need. They're in dire straits. And those other apostles, like the sophists, they're asking for money for themselves. They're arguing, they're flattering, they're asking for money. Paul is also arguing, he's also flattering, but he's not asking for himself. So he's saying a true apostle gives, a false one takes. And in verse 19, again, we get more building up. I haven't pointed out all the references to building up, but I mentioned that there are many. I invite you to look for them. 2 Corinthians 12:19 is just one more. And that brings us to chapter 13.
Yeah. So the first verse for me in chapter 13 that stood out the most was 5. He says, "Examine yourselves to see whether you are living in the faith. Test yourselves. Do you not realize that Jesus Christ is in you? Unless indeed you fail to meet the test," he says.
And my reading of that is, unless he isn't.
Yeah.
Right. And so is he? Is Jesus in me? And it's interesting, he says Jesus is in you. One of Paul's favorite expressions is en Christos, right? In Christ. But here it's Christ is in you.
Yeah.
It's not that you're in Christ, but Christ is in you. But I see it as a reciprocal relationship, two sides of the same coin.
Well, and this realize, I think this word realize here is important because this is an epistemological, right, realization of reality. And there's a verse in the Book of Mormon that talks about realizing and knowing from whence our blessings come, right? And that struck me when I read that some time ago, and I've thought about it a lot since, that, the blessings are coming to us anyway, right? Christ is in us, but do we realize it, right? Do we examine ourselves and see whether we're living according to that truth? Are we epistemologically accepting that, seeing that with our eyes? Whether it's a metaphysical reality or not is not the question, right? Paul is saying it is, but are you realizing it, right? And if you're not realizing it, if you're not examining it and seeing that, it's as if he isn't, right? Because you're not living within those privileges, so to speak.
I love that reading, Ben. I love that. That tastes good too. So the other thing we can do here is we can look at this and we can realize, right, that realizing isn't just becoming aware of. I think that's definitely part of it. I wouldn't disagree with you at all. But we can go farther and say that there's some work we have to do to make it real, right? It's not that it's not real already metaphysically. It's to make it real to ourselves, for us to actually realize something. This implies a change of state, right? I think this is like remembering. We think of remembering as a mental operation, and you and I have talked about what that means in a sacrament context. It's actually bringing the members back together, where the body of Christ has been dismembered when the bread is torn, representing his body. Which is interesting, by the way. The thing we've never talked about, Ben, is that not a single bone was broken, right? According to Isaiah, that it would be that way. And yet we tear the body, and Jesus did first, right? He tears the bread and he says, "This is my body." And then he gives it to the people and he says, it's being remembered. At least that's what our prayer says, right? Our prayer says we're remembering Christ. So here, realizing also doesn't mean necessarily a mental operation, right? You can think of realizing as something that you have to make it so, or make it, again, I don't think it's make it so, because metaphysically, of course, God is with you in Jesus and Christos, right? Emmanuel, God is with us. But the question is, do you make yourself aware of it? That's what I mean by realize, is to make yourself aware.
I think a parallel concept to this is some of the language that we use in the ordinance of the gift of the Holy Ghost. We say, receive the Holy Ghost, right? It's like this command, right? It's there. God's already given us the gift. Receive it, right? Because there's a sense in which you can be given gifts, but unless you receive them, right, accept them, realize that they're there, that they are yours, right? Because they can be given to you, but unless you realize they're yours, right, then there's not that, like you said, realize that it's not a reality to you that they're there.
Yeah.
Paul says in verse 9, there's this phrase, he says, that you may become perfect. So this word perfection that I think we so often use in English that typically connotes like without flaw, right? Without any blemish or flaw, absolutely immaculate, right? Actually, the Greek word here is a type of strengthening or maturation. And I think that fits here, right? Because Paul often talks to these people like they're children. He says he's going to give them milk. He actually in Galatians uses a metaphor of giving birth to them, which made me think of Moses, because Moses back in Numbers talks about how he, is the nursemaid for this nation, these people that God has given birth to, right? But in any case, this perfection right here is about a maturity, a spiritual maturity, a spiritual strengthening that's happening. And it's not really referring to, somebody having absolutely no flaws whatsoever.
Yeah, Ben, you and I haven't pointed out, and I don't know that you've even really come across this in your studies, but as I'm reading through the Jewish annotated New Testament from Amy Jill Levine, I get lots of instances in which it's pointed out to me that Paul is comparing himself to Moses.
Yeah.
That's exactly what's going on.
Yeah.
And by the way, that's part of what, we didn't go into this earlier, that's part of what it means to be an apostle. He's chosen directly by God. That's what he's saying. An apostle is a messenger for God. We have a different context for what apostle means. In Paul's context, an apostle and a prophet are different from our context. And so that apostleship, that being a messenger as he is, not like an angelos, not an angel, but someone who brings a revelation, is very much in the vein of Moses again.
Mm-hmm.
And so in conclusion, once again, in 2 Corinthians 13:10, we get authority from God is to build up, not to tear down. And wishing the listener a good week as usual, I would like to actually add, I'm just going to quote from Paul. From the closing of his letter, I'll close out our podcast with this quote: agree with one another, live in peace, and the God of love and peace will be with you. So be it. Amen.
Amen. Have a good week, everybody.
Thank you for listening.